We now come to the Statement of Secretary of State for Energy and Security, Ed Miliband.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by taking this opportunity to extend my sympathy to all those affected by Storm Bert? It has been a devastating event for people in different parts of our country, particularly in Wales, and my heart goes out to the families of those who have lost their lives and all those whose lives have been disrupted. I also, with your permission, Mr. Speaker, want to take this opportunity to pay tribute to Lord Prescott. He was a fighter for social justice. He was a champion of the environment. He rightfully has global recognition for his role in negotiating the Kyoto Protocol, and he showed how politics can change lives for the better. I send my deepest condolences to Pauline and his family. Mr. Speaker, with permission, I would like to make a statement about COP29. The UK attended COP29 to fight for our national interest, speeding up the clean energy transition in the interest of jobs, energy security and economic growth, and tackling the climate crisis for today's and future generations. In Baku, our message was clear. Britain is back in the business of global climate leadership. Because we know the impacts of the climate crisis know no borders. We've already seen the extreme impacts we can face here in Britain, and we know that if we do not act, these impacts will get much, much worse. That's why, as the Prime Minister said at COP29, there is no national security without climate security. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, it is precisely because Britain represents only around 1% of annual global emissions that we have to work with others to ensure the remaining 99% of emissions are addressed to protect the British people. Now, the focus of this COP was on finance for developing countries, because the reality is that unless we persuade developing countries to go down the clean energy development path, we cannot hope to reduce emissions and prevent climate disaster. These countries face the triple challenges of needing to invest in the clean energy transition, coping with the costs of climate vulnerability, and needing to develop to take their populations out of poverty. At the same time, developed countries, including Britain, face extreme pressure on our public finances. The COP talks are always complex, but these circumstances made this set of talks particularly so. And I want to put on record my thanks to our outstanding team of civil servants who supported me at COP. I was repeatedly struck by the enormous respect they have from so many countries around the world. The UK's negotiating team was led by Alison Campbell, who is leaving to go to work with the UN Secretary-General. And I want to put on record my special thanks to her in helping us to reach an agreement. The agreement reached is to provide and mobilise at least $300 billion of climate finance by 2035 for developing countries. Much of this will come from the multilateral development banks like the World Bank, who have stepped up to set a target to substantially increase the climate finance they provide. Importantly, for the first time, the agreement reflects a new global landscape where traditional donors will be joined by big emitters like China to help finance the transition. This is fair and it is right. The UK will decide what our own contribution will be in the context of our own spending review and fiscal situation, and it will come, of course, from within the UK aid budget. I can inform the House that if delivered with the same impact as UK climate finance, the $300 billion deal could lead to emissions reductions which are the equivalent to more than 15 times the UK's annual emissions, as well as helping to protect up to 1 billion people in developing countries from the effects of floods, heat waves and droughts. And crucially, this agreement will accelerate the global clean energy transition, which offers the prospect of export and economic opportunities here in Britain. So let nobody be in any doubt, Mr. Speaker, this agreement is absolutely in our national interest. Now, in other aspects, the talks were more disappointing. At COP28, the world made a historic agreement to transition away from fossil fuels. That agreement stands, but we did not reach agreement this year on how to take this commitment forward. Not because the text put forward was too ambitious, but because it wasn't ambitious enough. In particular, many developing countries, including the small island states, felt the text put forward was just inadequate to the scale of the climate emergency. Developed countries, including Britain, agreed with this view. And, Mr. Speaker, this offers an important lesson. Under this government, Britain is part of a global coalition for ambitious climate action that spans global north and global south, the global centre ground of climate politics. And we will now seek to build on the agreement at COP30 next year in Brazil. At this COP, the UK also made important announcements on countering deforestation, scaling up private finance and nuclear cooperation as part of the clean energy transition. And the Prime Minister announced our nationally determined contribution to reduce emissions by at least 81% by 2035 compared to 1990 levels. This follows the advice we received from the Independent Climate Change Committee. Let me be clear, Mr. Speaker, this target is right for Britain, for energy security, for good jobs and growth. On the same day as the announcement, Scottish Power and Siemens announced a £1 billion deal to invest in wind manufacturing in Hull, boosting British manufacturing and supporting 1,300 good jobs in our industrial heartlands, showing what the clean energy mission can do for Britain and building on the steps this government has already taken. Lifting the onshore wind ban, consenting nearly 2 gigawatts of solar, setting up Great British Energy, delivering a record-breaking renewables auction, kick-starting our carbon capture and hydrogen industries, and driving towards cheaper, cleaner heating through our Warm Homes plan. And, Mr. Speaker, it is in our national interest to use the power of our example to work with others to speed up the clean energy transition globally. Just as the 2008 Climate Change Act, supported across this House, inspired others to follow our lead. That's why at the G20 in Brazil, the Prime Minister launched the Global Clean Power Alliance to drive forward this transition along with a number of other countries. But, Mr. Speaker, this is just the start of the work we need to do in the run-up to COP30 to make next year's talks a success. Because the truth is that despite progress over the last 2 weeks, the truth is we are halfway through the decisive decade for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, and the world is way off track. Other countries like Brazil have also announced ambitious NDCs, and in the months ahead we will continue to push others to go further and faster in raising ambition, in scaling up finance, in protecting nature and forests, and in driving forward the clean energy transition. Let me end by saying this. The COP process is tortuous and progress is too slow. However, this government believes that while multilateralism, in other words, cooperating with others, is hard, it is the only way to truly fight for Britain. Those who say we should disengage from these negotiations and step off the stage would let down our country, deprive us of a voice, and leave future generations paying the price. Despite all the difficulties, at COP29, one truth was overwhelmingly clear. The global transition away from fossil fuels and towards clean energy is happening, and it is unstoppable. Unstoppable because clean energy is the route to energy security. Unstoppable because it is the economic opportunity of our time, and unstoppable because people in Britain and around the world can see the climate crisis is here, and unless we act, things will only get worse. In less than 5 months, this government has shown we will seize the opportunities of speeding up at home, and we have demonstrated climate leadership abroad to deliver energy independence, lower bills, good jobs, economic growth, and the security of a stable climate. Doing all we can, Mr. Speaker, to keep the British people safe now and for generations to come, and I commend this statement to the House.
Secretary of State Clerk Coutinho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. I echo his comments on Stormbird and thank the emergency services for all they've done to help those in need. And I also want to start by passing on my personal condolences to the Right Honourable Gentleman on the passing of John Prescott. I know he wanted him to lead the Paris Accords in 2015, having admired his work in Kyoto. And I believe he described John as someone who could bash heads together at the time. So I hope, as the Secretary of State's opposite number, I can achieve some of that head bashing that he so clearly valued in John. So, Mr. Speaker, in that vein, the Secretary of State has talked a lot about regaining global leadership, but I fear that he's stuck in 2009. He may not want to acknowledge this, but for the past 14 years, we've been a global leader. We are the only major economy, the only one to have halved carbon emissions since 1990. In that same time, America's emissions have stayed the same and China's have tripled. However, what we have seen is that countries are not persuaded just because Britain is going further and faster. They're persuaded by prosperity and they're persuaded by living standards. We are 1% of global emissions, and if he continues down the path he set out, I fear that our country will face hardship and there'll be no point in being world leading because nobody will want to follow our lead. He would make us a warning, not an example to others. So let's start with what he announced at COP. The Secretary of State has set out a new target to cut our greenhouse gas emissions by 81% by 2035. However, what we didn't hear in his statement is how much this will cost the British people. The Independent Climate Change Committee say that this target would require people to eat less meat and dairy, take fewer flights, swap their boilers for heat pumps and their petrol cars for EVs at a pace that will require taxes and mandation. Even the chair of the Select Committee has acknowledged people will be forced to change their lives. But the Secretary of State says not to worry. He'll deliver all the savings through energy policy, and those plans will lead to higher growth, cutting bills, creating jobs and strengthening national security. But none of those things are true when it comes to his plans. The Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies has already said that his climate plans won't lead to growth. The National Energy System Operators Report showed that his rush for Clean Power 2030 is going to add eye-watering costs to our energy system. And despite those very expensive costs, it would still leave gas pricing the system around 50% of the time, or would leave the equivalent of millions of homes in the dark waiting for the wind to blow. I don't think that's anybody's idea of energy or national security. But, Mr. Speaker, he doesn't have to take my word for it. The head of offshore wind development at RWE, one of the country's largest wind developers, has warned that the Right Honourable Gentleman's rush to meet his 2030 target will lead to price spikes, with consumers losing out. The chief executive of Octopus has warned about the £6 billion of costs that consumers will have to pay because the Right Honourable Gentleman wants to build renewables without reforming the grid. And the former head of MI6 has warned that the Secretary of State, and I quote, this is worth listening to because it's their former head of MI6. The former head of MI6 has said, and I quote, that the Secretary of State is pursuing completely crazy energy policy when it comes to national security. And when it comes to jobs, his plans to make our energy expensive and unreliable will see jobs fleeing to more polluting countries because it's cheap energy and innovation which matter in the race for jobs. And you only need to ask China, which dominates clean tech supply chains and is the world's largest polluter. That's where billions of pounds of our taxpayers' money will be going to pay for his rush transition, from our country with all the investment it has made into clean power to a country still 60% powered by coal. Low growth, high bills, jobs lost, even blackouts, for more carbon in the atmosphere, Mr. Speaker. That's the opposite of what he's been promising. And in Baku, while he was signing us up to these targets without talking about what they will do for life for British people, he was also signing away billions of pounds of taxpayers' money. He signed us up to a $300 billion annual climate finance target, and I'm afraid it's not credible to say that taxpayers won't have to pay more, and they deserve to know by how much. So can he tell us today what that new target will mean for British taxpayers? And I think, considering the increase in the target, the public will rightly question why countries like Russia, and particularly China, now the world's largest polluter and second largest by historical standards, will not be obliged to pay a penny. I think he tried to insist that they would, but it's very clear that they will not be obliged at all to pay in. Whilst Britain, which has invested billions in cutting its own emissions and is only 1% of global emissions, will have to pay more. Well, he also set out an assessment on the increased reliance on coal-powered Chinese imports for his 2030 zero-carbon plans and what that means for global emissions. Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State is not being honest with the British public. He promised them £300 of their energy bills by 2030, but just weeks ago he whipped his Labour MPs to vote that pledge down. He took away the winter fuel payment despite promising the elderly would be looked after under his energy policy. And he's now saying he can achieve higher climate targets in a way that's zero cost to the public. This is not a recipe for climate leadership, Mr. Speaker. It's a recipe for higher bills and lost jobs, and it will be a disaster for the British public.
Can I just say, just to remind front benches, is 5 minutes. OK. Secretary of State.
Oh dear, oh dear. OK, let me deal with questions such as they are, Mr. Speaker. Let's start with our nationally determined contribution announced at COP. It's so interesting that she now opposes this, because the 2035 NDC, announced by the Prime Minister, is exactly the target her government legislated for in 2021 in the 6th carbon budget, which covers 2035, which means she is now opposing, Mr. Speaker, the very same target her government put into law. And she claimed that she was working towards as Secretary of State just a few months ago. And, Mr. Speaker, there is a pattern here. Every week, the Right Honourable Lady takes to Twitter to express her latest outrage about a policy, asking who on earth could support this. And every week, someone pops up in her replies and says politely, "You did, just a few months back." Because this isn't the only one, Mr. Speaker. Last week, she came out against the clean heat market mechanism, another policy she proposed. In fact, I have a statement from her from only 8 months ago, where she said it will be coming in, the clean heat market mechanism, in April 2025, exactly what this government is doing. And the truth is, Mr. Speaker, any passing bandwagon, and she'll leap on it, even if it means trashing her record. And let me give her a little lesson about opposition. The job of opposition is to oppose the government, not to oppose yourself. And this is where she has ended up. And so out of the window goes any commitment to climate action, ignoring the fact it's the route to energy security, good jobs and lower bills, ignoring the fact it's backed by business, ignoring the fact that this country has an honourable tradition of a bipartisan consensus. I'm happy to say that the last government proposed some ambitious targets, that COP26 was an important milestone for the world. And the truth is about this is it's not just irresponsible. It's not just crass opportunism. It's also actually what helped take the Conservative Party down to their worst election defeat in 200 years. So it's not going to work for her. Now, let me tell her what the Clean Energy Superpower Mission means for Britain. It means cleaning up our power system so we don't leave the country exposed as they did to fossil fuels. It means new jobs in carbon capture and storage as we decarbonise industry and reindustrialise. It means energy efficiency in homes, meaning lower bills, warmer homes and lower emissions. And as for the NESO report that she talks about, I know it's deeply disappointing to her, but we've got an independent report that says the following. First of all, 2030 is achievable. She said it wasn't. It also says it will give us energy security, which she says it wouldn't give us. And it says that it can lead to lower electricity, something she constantly denied. The truth about the Right Honourable Lady is that she's got nothing to say about the COP. It's basically the Conservative Party is stop the world, I want to get off. Well, stop the world, I want to get off is going to do nothing for the British people. The truth is she's got a lot to learn, and I'm afraid she needs to start reflecting. She needs to start reflecting on where her government went wrong. And it went wrong in many different ways, and she seems to be learning no lessons.
The lesson, Chair of the Select Committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I just very gently say to the Shadow Secretary of State, she really shouldn't believe dodgy headlines in the Daily Telegraph. In fact, I don't know if there are headlines in the Daily Telegraph that are ever not dodgy based on what she was quoting there. But more importantly, can I congratulate the Prime Minister on his leadership at COP? And can I congratulate the Secretary of State on leading the negotiations, not least in delivering the £300 billion of climate finance for developing countries. Can I ask him, though, he set out this country's achievements since the general election. Can I ask him then, to what extent does he think that the combination of what this country showed at COP and what we've delivered at home since the 4th of July will encourage countries around the world to play their part in addressing the climate crisis?
My honourable friend asks a really important question. I think there are two truths that you take out of COP, which is one, that the transition is unstoppable, and secondly, that it is not going fast enough. But it is such a difference than it was a decade ago. And my honourable friend who was there with me, I think, is nodding in agreement, because every country knows that the climate crisis is happening and affecting them, and the testimony you hear, it's like the testimony we could provide about what people are seeing. So they know that they have to act. Every country faces constraints in acting, but they also know, and this is the big change from a decade ago, that it is massively in their economic interest, that there is a race on for the good jobs of the future, and the clean energy transition can provide them.
The Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Ross Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. COP29 has concluded with a deal that, while welcome, leaves much to be desired. I must stress that we need bolder, more decisive action if we're to face the greatest challenge of our time, the climate crisis. I know that the Right Honourable Gentleman's heart is in the right place and has been for many years. We first met in the run-up to the COP15 in 2009, and I would like to express my thanks to him for his staunch leadership in the intervening years. I would also like to express Lib Dem's support for a brave programme of action going forward and our willingness to work with his department to help the UK step up and seize this opportunity for climate leadership. While we welcome the Prime Minister's commitment to ambitious emissions targets for 2035, commitments alone are not enough. Immediate action is needed to insulate homes, reduce energy costs, and ensure that no one has to choose between heating and eating. The delay to Labour's Warm Homes Plan until spring 2025 is unacceptable when millions, including 1.2 million pensioners, face a cold and unaffordable winter due to the cut in the winter fuel allowance. In my constituency of the South Cotswolds and all across the UK, we've seen firsthand the devastating effects of climate change, and never more so than over the last few days, with floods and storms becoming more frequent and more severe. Towns and villages in my constituency, such as Perkins, Great Somerford and Cirencester, have been severely affected by flooding, and we need urgent action now to both mitigate climate change and help our communities adapt to the likely impacts now and in the future. I would also like to take this opportunity to associate myself with the thanks already expressed to the brave men and women of our emergency services in the aftermath of Storm Bert. Climate leadership must prioritise solutions that protect communities and restore nature. Natural flood defences like wetlands. My apologies, I thought I had 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Better instruction.
May I finish with a question? Will the Secretary of State commit to including natural flood defences as a central part of the £5.2 billion flood defence spending, ensuring that communities like those in the South Cotswolds are better protected from the worsening impacts of climate change while also addressing biodiversity loss?
Secretary of State.
Well, can I thank the Honourable Lady for her questions and for her support for ambitious action, which is important. I think, let me pick out a couple of points that she made. Look, the first in particular on the way in which the devastating effects of climate are already apparent. It's such an important point. And in a way, I think part of the danger, Mr. Speaker, is that they end up being the new normal, and we just think this is part of life. Now, in some sense, it is part of life, and we need, as she said, the right flood defences in place and so on. But we also need to realise that these effects will get worse, significantly worse, if we do not act, and future generations will, frankly, hold us in infamy if they say, well, you knew about the scale of the devastation, you'd seen a preview of what was to come, and you decided you couldn't act. So I think she's absolutely right about that. Secondly, let me just sort of gently correct her on the Warm Homes Plan. We're getting on with the Warm Homes Plan. Indeed, announcements were made last week about actions which will help over 300,000 families to benefit from homes upgrades next year, announcements around heat pumps, a whole range of announcements to help families do better and be able to lower their energy bills. Let me just make one other point, which I think was part of what she was saying, which is this is a climate crisis and it's also a nature crisis. It's a climate and biodiversity crisis. And if there was another issue that I think could have been made more of at COP and was a bit disappointing, it was that nature part of the agenda didn't get maybe the attention it deserved. And I think that is very, very important for COP30 in Brazil.
Right, Chair of the Environmental Audit, Toby Perkins.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. No one can doubt the leadership that my right honourable friend and the Prime Minister showed in Baku, and he deserves great credit for that. But I think he's right to say there is a danger in overselling the achievements of this COP. The developing nations have been very critical, actually, about the financial agreement that was reached and on the commitments that were made in Paris on fossil fuels, as he said, were not followed through. Can he spell out what he sees as the main barriers right now to getting the action that we need and the pace of action that he needs, and whether he has any confidence that at Rio we will see the real breakthrough that the world is waiting for?
Well, he sort of asked absolutely the right question, Mr. Speaker. Look, I think the truth on the finance side is that this does represent a significant scaling up at a time when developed countries and developing countries face extreme pressure on the public finances. Just to say there is a significant development here, which is that the flows to the multilateral development banks from developing countries or large emitters rather like China will now count towards the overall finance goal. That is a big change and a big step forward. On the question of the transition away from fossil fuels, look, the barrier is that countries, some countries are worried about what it means for them. That's totally understandable. Some countries think this will be problematic for their prosperity, and the truth is we're just going to have to make better efforts to ensure that the majority of countries that do want to see action prevail at next year's COP, and that is going to be hard yards. And also, finally, we must have a campaign, and this is something we'll work on with Brazil, for ambitious NDCs, because that is crucial at this moment. That is the job of the next COP.
David Mundell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend to the Secretary of State the UK Small Islands Development State Strategy report, which was produced by the International Development Committee just before Parliament was dissolved by the general election. And a key focus of that report is the need to support these island states, not just at COP, but all the time in terms of the UK being an advocate for their needs and requirements across the international community.
Well, the right honourable gentleman is absolutely right. He speaks with customary eloquence on this issue. This is literally an existential issue for the small island states, and their testimony at COP is compelling and deeply distressing, and that's why the finance deal is important. It's not everything they wanted, but it's a step forward.
Holly Billington.
I welcome the Secretary of State's statement today and the agreement reached at COP29 in Baku. He and I go back a long way on COPs, and we know what it's like when it goes wrong. But particularly, I would welcome the nationally determined contribution to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 2035 by 81%. Does he agree with me that the fundamental reason why we have leadership on the global stage now, as distinct from what we've had for the last 14 years, is not just because of the target, but because we have a plan? This COP was supposed to be about implementation, and where we lead in implementation, others will follow.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. She was with me at Copenhagen, and I definitely had sort of Copenhagen PTSD at these talks at various moments in the middle of the night. On this point about the target and the action, it's absolutely right. And I think there is global recognition that this government has upped the pace in the whole multiple ways that I described in my statement, and that is incredibly important. And that is also important because business sees it happening, and business then thinks Britain is a country that is clear about its direction, and we will invest there.
Steff Aquarone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can only speak for North Norfolk, but I can say that a green energy future is an exciting future for our local economy, especially at Bacton. But just along the coast, villages like Haysborough are suffering from being part of the fastest eroding coastline in Europe. He's touched on coastal erosion in answer to my honourable friend, but can I push him? Specifically, how will the outcomes of COP29 reassure my residents who are worried about losing their homes to coastal erosion now?
Well, as far as COP29 is concerned, speeding up global action. And, when I described in my statement what this finance deal could mean, something like the equivalent of 15 times the emissions of Britain reduction, this is hard going, but that is the way that we reduce the temperature rises that are going to take place. The world is in danger of busting through 1.5 degrees and going beyond that, and that's why the action is so urgent, and that's why this finance deal really matters.
Ian McAllister.
Two times. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I strongly welcome the Secretary of State's signing of a new UK-US Advanced Nuclear Technology Agreement at COP. And I'd like to ask the Secretary of State to share a little bit more of the details of that agreement, and also whether he agrees with me that it could form the basis for a much more ambitious agreement between the UK and US on civil nuclear development.
Well, this was an important agreement, and I'm glad my honourable friend has drawn attention to it. This is about the next generation of nuclear power stations, and the truth is about this is that, and it grows across clean energy in nuclear, in renewables and elsewhere, that global cooperation, bilateral cooperation, we can learn so much from each other, we can work with each other, we can work with US companies and UK companies, and there can be huge benefits right across the country.
Rebecca Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Thursday, the Prime Minister implied that the new wind energy project in Hull would result in lower energy bills for my constituents in South West Devon. He refused to say when by, though. So when can my constituents and others across the country expect to see the Labour Party's promised £300 reduction in their bills?
If she reads the NISO report, which is the advice given to us from the independent body, they show that this will lead to lower electricity bills. And this is so important because there's two protections that we get from Clean Power 2030. One is lower bills, and secondly, we are protected against the devastating price spikes that affected her constituents during the gas price crisis of 2022.
Clydesdale.
Speaker, when I consider this sort of issue, I tend to think of my grandchildren and what the world is going to be like for them in years to come. And I listen to my right honourable friend and the achievements that we have made over the last 5 months. And then I listen to the response from the party opposite, and it fills me with horror. Yeah. In spite of what my right honourable friend says, there was tough negotiations at this COP. And he has to be congratulated for the role that he played in achieving the agreements that we got there. Yeah. How essential does he believe it is that we continue with that leadership going forwards when we consider what could have happened if the Conservatives have stayed in power?
Look, I think where my honourable friend is right is that, look, we obviously have party political disagreement on issues, but one thing that this country has avoided is the situation that has taken place in some other countries, which is a fraying and indeed a splitting of this consensus. And the reason why the consensus on climate action is so important is precisely for the reasons that my honourable friend set out, which is the fate of his grandchildren, all of our future generations, and the impact on them. So, I want to work with people across parties on this issue, because the more of a consensus we can have, the better it is for the country.
Paula Daniel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Low-income countries were extremely disappointed by the finance agreements at COP. $300 billion does not come anywhere near the level of need. And critically, there was no clarity on how much would be grants as opposed to loans, which will plunge Global South countries further into debt. So does the Secretary of State share my concern about the potential dominance of loans and an over-reliance on the private sector? And does he agree with me that considerable public finance could and should be raised through taxes on the most polluting companies?
Well, look, I understand why the Honourable Lady expresses that disappointment. Indeed, some developing countries, a number of developing countries express that disappointment. I would say to her that I think this is a considerable scaling up. I mean, to state the obvious, because the $100 billion was the previous commitment, a considerable scaling up of the resources. It is the provision and mobilisation of resources. She's right about the balance between grants and loans, and also the funds that are required for adaptation. But the truth is that public finance on its own is never going to meet the need. That's why the agreement on carbon markets that was part of this COP is important, and that's why the mobilisation of private finance and working on a roadmap to that mobilisation of private finance, part of the agreement too, is so important.
Shelley James.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Secretary of State's statement today? and acknowledge that the UK is very lucky to have unique resources which put us at the forefront of the energy transition? And would he also acknowledge that industrial heartlands like our own in Doncaster were frankly let down by the last government with promise after promise, announcement after announcement and no delivery? So will he set out what the Labour government are going to do to back British industry and, more importantly, coalfields like our own?
Well, my honourable friend and neighbour is absolutely right about this, and this is where the opportunities are huge. For South Yorkshire, the opportunities around hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, the jobs in insulating homes. This is, you know, we know that what many of our industrial heartlands have been crying out for is good jobs at good wages, and they've been crying out for them for a long time. This is the opportunity to make them happen.
James Wilde.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. COP leaders agreed to triple climate finance to £300 billion a year. The Secretary of State referred to the spending review in his statement, but he signed up, the Prime Minister signed up to this international commitment. He must know how much the UK is going to have to pay. Will he tell the House?
That's not the way it works. The way it works is that we set a global total and then it's for individual countries to come forward with their contributions. That's the way it works.
George Fenton, Glen.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome my honourable friend's statement today. My constituency is at the mercy of climate change, as this weekend's flood showed. And hearing the opposition fail to grasp that urgency is deeply frustrating for many of my constituents. Correct. And while we're on the front line of climate change's impact, we also want to be on the front line of the response. And that's why many in my constituency welcome the Warm Homes Plan. Could the member update me what he's doing to make sure we bring forward a workforce to deliver that work, that Warm Homes Plan, particularly in constituencies like mine, which have got quite hard houses to retrofit?
Well, I think my honourable friend makes a really, really important point, and we are working through my department, the Office of Clean Energy Jobs, with Skills England, to make sure that we have that workforce plan, because there's huge job opportunities here. We need to make sure we have the workforce plan. We need to have to make sure that people have the assurance that their work is going to be properly regulated and that they can expect high standards. This is a massive national mission for the country, and we'll be coming forward with more proposals on this in the coming months.
Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We learned from the Minister's statement three things. The first one is that the climate finance will come from the existing UK aid budget. Can the Minister reassure the House that the increase in the UK aid budget will be greater than the amount that's gone on climate finance, so that we can be confident that we're not robbing Peter to pay Paul in the developed world? And important agreements on deforestation. Does this mean that the UK will stop spending almost £11 billion on subsidies to burn trees in England to generate electricity? Is that one of the important elements about deforestation he talked about? And he claims in the statement that GB Energy is set up. Can he tell us where we can go and see it?
Thanks so much for the support. Let me deal with his questions in turn. It's always been the case that climate finance is part of the aid budget. This is not some new announcement that I've made, and obviously that is a decision that we make along with the Foreign Office and other colleagues across government about the right balance of resources and where the greatest need lies. As for GB Energy, he knows it's going to be headquartered in Aberdeen, and we are getting on with setting it up. We have a start-up chair in Jürgenmeier, and GB Energy is ploughing ahead. We've only been in office less than 5 months. The legislation is going through, and it will happen. His second question, I think, was about Drax. The last government issued a consultation on that, and we'll be responding in the months ahead.
Richard Berg.
Thank you, Speaker. The Secretary of State was absolutely right to say at the close of the climate talks that the only way to keep the British people safe from extreme weather and economic disruption is to ensure the world acts together. That requires funding. It's clear the COP at Azerbaijan didn't deliver that at the scale needed. The Make Polluters Pay coalition is calling for the big oil companies worldwide that have made grotesque profits whilst driving the climate crisis to fund the required investments at home and abroad. Isn't that the fair way to secure the finance needed?
Look, we've obviously got to look at all of these issues. These global levies and taxes are always quite complex and difficult things to make happen. We have said that we will support the idea of the maritime levy, but I think we need to sort of proceed cautiously on these issues because, frankly, I think what's important is that the finance is provided, but these are discussions that we will obviously engage in the months ahead.
John Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As champions of the North Sea, the previous government underpinned 200,000 jobs right across the UK. What then does the Secretary of State say to OE UK, who say that the government's energy tax has stripped out something around £13 billion of investment in the North Sea, money that won't be recovered by the anaemic and frankly invisible GB Energy?
Well, look, we just disagree on the idea that we shouldn't have taxed the unearned profits of the energy companies, which was paid for direct by the British people. And I have to say to the honourable gentleman, if he wants to say that we should not have had a windfall tax on the oil and gas companies, I think he's way out of line with his constituents.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in Walthamstow are very proud that one of our own, Samir Dumbaya, was one of the Future Leaders Network working with the UK Youth Climate Coalition at Baku. I know that the Secretary of State will agree with me that young people need to be at the heart of what comes next following COP, and they welcome the proposed NDCs, but they now need a direct and dedicated place in making those happen. So can you tell us what formal mechanism for the oversight and delivery of the reduction by 81% of emissions by 2035 does he envisage for the young people of the UK?
I think my honourable friend asked a really important question, and I met with some of the youth campaigners and youth coalition at COP, and I agreed with them that the UK had signed up to a youth clause in our NDC, which is about recognising young people as agents of change when it comes to climate and the need to engage with young people. And I would love to talk to her and those young people about how we take those issues forward in the months ahead.
Sarah Day.
I thank the Secretary of State for his statement and agree that the UK must show global leadership on climate action. Peatlands are the largest natural terrestrial carbon store, yet damaged peatlands are responsible for almost 5% of global anthropogenic CO2 emissions. While the UK imports 60% of peat used in horticulture, offshoring carbon emissions abroad. So does the Secretary of State agree with me that beyond COP29, we must continue to show global leadership and protect the environment by committing to a phased ban in peat in horticulture?
Well, look, let me just deal with the wider issue of peatlands, because there was money allocated in the budget for these issues through DEFRA, and that is important. It's a sort of very important issue, and the wider issue there is important. And we also need to make progress at a global level. As to those other issues, they're actually a matter for DEFRA, but I undertake to write to her on those issues.
Scott Arthur.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for his statement. I was proud of the constructive role that the UK played in the negotiations, representing our country and also some of the poorest people on the planet who are at the absolute front line against climate change, partly due to the emissions from this country. But COP is not without its critics, despite it being the only platform to progress our climate ambitions. So I'd like to ask the Secretary of State how he thinks that the process could be improved, and in particular, what gentle advice he would give to anyone thinking about taking over the presidency of a major world economy early next year.
I'll resist the second half of his question, if you don't mind, Mr. Speaker. But on the first part of the question, look, the COP process does have its critics. I think I'd say a couple of things. First of all, 15 years ago, when I last attended the COP as Secretary of State in Copenhagen, no country was signed up to net zero. Now 90% of the world's GDP is covered by net zero. Now, that's not only because of the COP, but that process of international engagement is important, and it's a forcing mechanism to put world leaders on the spot. And secondly, I think the reason it's hard is largely because you've got 198 countries all trying to agree. And that is difficult. So if people can think of improvements to the system, that's great. But I do think that engagement is really important.
Sammy Wilson.
Let me get this straight. The Minister is welcoming a conference to deal with CO2 where the host country tried to use it to sell oil and gas deals, where the major producers of CO2, the leaders of those countries, didn't even bother turning up, where we sent 490 civil servants, flew them out to attend the conference, and where the main topic was how do we extract money from countries who were guilty of the sin of industrialisation. And the Minister has shot out his chest today, saying we're now leaders in global climate. It's hard to be a leader when you have no followers, Minister, that's all I can say. But could I ask a question? How can the Minister face the hard-pressed taxpayers of the United Kingdom who are reeling under the impact of the latest budget and expect them to pay out billions to foreign countries?
Secretary of State.
Well, the honourable gentleman and I have been debating these issues for 15 years, and I hazard a guess that we're not going to end up agreeing. The thing I would say to him gently is the truth about the climate crisis is it is the biggest potential cost that future generations can face. Trillions of costs across the world, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of costs in the UK if we do not act. And all of the evidence is that the costs of acting on climate change are much less than the costs of not acting.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was in Paris 9 years ago when we started the process of negotiation on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. It was only concluded with the gavel going down in Baku. It's an important process ensuring a carbon market through the UNFCCC. How will the UK implement the new Article 6 regulations, and how will we support other countries in this important work as we can utilise it for those nature-based solutions like reforestation, afforestation?
Well, I think the honourable gentleman, my honourable friend, makes a really important point, and maybe it's a slight counter to the honourable gentleman who just spoke. This is beneath the headlines. This is where the hard yards of work at COP happened. It's taken 10 years to do these Article 6 negotiations and to complete them. But this is about carbon markets, voluntary carbon markets. In answer to his question, we're consulting on some of the high integrity principles for that. But this, again, will make a difference to developing countries and will get funds flowing to them. And that's another reason why these COPs are worthwhile.
Good job.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State is in consensus building mode. Can I offer him the opportunity to address the 10,975 members of my Spelthorne constituency who are going to be losing their winter fuel payments, or the 100,000 pensioners who are going to be plunged into poverty? Could he explain to them why they're wrong when they see the government taking money from their pocket and in order to be able to have enough money to send overseas?
Well, he is wrong to say this. Look, the truth is that the last government left the public finances in an appalling state. And that is why those decisions were made. And as I've explained, we've agreed a global total when it comes to climate, but UK contributions are a matter for us and our spending reviews and depending on our fiscal situation.
Carl Turner.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Doesn't the £1 billion Siemens deal in East Hull go to prove the government's commitment to making the UK a clean energy superpower?
My honourable friend is right about this, and he's been a great champion on these issues. And it does show the opportunities that there are. There are countless opportunities across the world, even including in relation to this finance deal, because this is going to create huge business opportunities. And the truth is that governments all across the world are alive to these opportunities. I want Britain to win. These jobs are the future.
Andrew Murison.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Where's the leadership, and what example does it set to fly 470 officials and delegates halfway across the world to a climate change jamboree, more than any other Western European country? And can the Secretary of State say what the cost has been in terms of carbon and cash?
I mean, I do say to the honourable gentleman that there is a long tradition of civil servants playing a really important role at these COPs. In fact, we sent 100 fewer civil servants to this COP than the last one under the last government. He might be interested to know. But I absolutely defend public servants doing a brilliant job going to these COPs. Why? Because it is absolutely in the British national interest.
John Slinger.
Speaker,
Echoing the comments of my honourable friend, the member for Walthamstow, would my right honourable friend agree to considering taking a young person, perhaps from a sixth form or university, along to the next COP meeting as an advisor to remind our delegation, and indeed delegations around the world, that it is their future that is on the table?
Well, there are indeed members of the Youth Climate Coalition who go to these COPs, and I don't want to sort of interfere in their processes for picking those people. But I think the general point he makes about the voice of young people is really important. You know, it is also, they represent young people, but they also represent future generations. And I think hearing the voices of how future generations will regard the actions we do or don't take is incredibly important.
Clydesdale.
Deputy Speaker, despite today's statement noting it in the UK's interest to speed up the clean energy, we still need urgent clarity on clean energy project. Will the Secretary of State finally confirm the government's plan for nuclear at Wilva in my constituency of Ynysmon?
Well, we do think that Wilva has very important prospects, Madam Deputy Speaker. And the truth is that there is an important pipeline of nuclear projects that we are moving forward with, and we look forward to discussions in the coming months about Wilva.
Tom Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I commend the Secretary of State for his leadership and for his statement today and join his bipartisanship? I am happy to recognise the contributions of Theresa May and Boris Johnson, but it says a lot when it takes Labour members of Parliament to do it, because the Conservative front bench opposite are running so fast and so far away from them. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that clean energy is how we achieve energy security, and energy security is how we achieve national security when our world is in turmoil and this country faces threats like never before?
His second point is absolutely right, and his first point is absolutely right too. I am very happy to acknowledge the role of Theresa May in putting net zero into law, in recognising the role of Alok Sharma, even also in recognising the role of Boris Johnson, who sought to champion some of these issues. It's a real shame, and it speaks volumes, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we can say those things and they don't.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I have to say I do agree with the last speaker who talked about there being no national security without energy security. Because we discovered after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia how dependent the UK was on imported gas. When talking to other countries, did the government make the case for investment in clean energy and how it can reduce dependency on malign petrostates like Russia?
I think the honourable gentleman is absolutely right about this. I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine demonstrated to us the truth, which is that, unfortunately, fossil fuels do not give us energy security. Because whether the fossil fuels came from the North Sea or they were imported, prices shot through the roof, and our constituents paid the price, and government paid out £94 billion in support. And that's why our Clean Energy Superpower mission is so important, because to give us the energy security that side completely failed to give us.
Abdesam Mohammed.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I commend the Energy Secretary's work both here in the UK and for his global leadership at COP29. Many developing countries continue to face the intensifying effects of the climate crisis. For their sake and for ours, we cannot afford inaction and delay. Can the Secretary of State clarify what specific work will be undertaken to improve the global ambitions so that we can transition away from fossil fuels and keep alive the commitment to keep the world's temperature rise below 1.5?
Well, my honourable friend asked absolutely the right question, and that is the work that we will be undertaking with Brazil and other like-minded countries in the year ahead. The next year marks a very, very important moment where 5 years from the last time the world did this, we have to set targets for 2035, or NDCs for 2035. This is such an important moment because it's the way we need to get back on track for keeping temperature rises down, and we're straining every sinew to work with others to make that happen.
Jim Shannon.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it's always a pleasure to hear the Secretary of State committing a strategy and a plan that does look forward, even though we may have some questions in relation to it. My fear, Secretary of State, has always been that the funding that has been granted, and indeed is incredibly substantial, how will the Secretary of State ensure that this huge pot of funding is used to achieve the necessary aims and not siphoned off or lost in the process. I say this bearing in mind that pushing a pen around and making a way through red tape can be a very costly endeavour. That money needs to go to the projects that make a difference. How can this be guaranteed before we allocate any more of our taxpayers' hard-pressed money? Thank you so much.
I think the honourable gentleman raises a really, really important point, which is actually, as much as developing countries were wanting the biggest possible sum in relation to supporting them, they were as worried about the quality of finance as they were about the quantum and their access to funds. Because the thing I heard time and again from developing countries was we wait years and years to actually access the funds that are available. So making sure it's spent on the right things and that it's accessible for those countries is crucial work that now needs to happen in the months and years ahead.
Alistair Strathern.
Deputy Speaker, can I welcome the statement and the leadership this government showed at COP29, recognising that with the global transition well underway, the economic benefits will accrue to those who lead and shape it, rather than those who shy away from it and remain all too passive in the face of the economic forces it heralds. Can the Secretary of State set out how we'll make sure we capture those benefits so domestically and show the leadership we need to drive investment, growth and opportunities to every part of the UK to ensure that we've got a coherent economic strategy that touches every part of our nation?
Well, I think both parts of what my honourable friend says are right. Since we are only 1% of global emissions, we must work with others to make sure we tackle this problem. And also, I think the biggest thing I find in this job is that clarity of purpose and direction makes a huge difference to private investors. Uncertainty is the enemy of investment. The certainty and the direction that this government is providing is absolutely the friend of companies investing in the UK.
Jonathan Brash.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The constituencies like mine in Hartlepool and regions like the North East once powered the British economy. Does he agree with me that the leadership that we're now showing must secure investment for those regions that have been far too often left behind, and that investment must include new nuclear for towns like Hartlepool?
Absolutely right, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is the route to reindustrialisation. Nuclear is an absolutely central part of this government's clean energy mission. As I always say to people, we need all of the technologies at our disposal. We know that electricity use is going to at least double by 2050, and so we need all of the technologies at our disposal.
Mark Stewarts.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Can I start by welcoming the Right Honourable Member's statement and for showing such leadership on the world stage alongside the Prime Minister. He mentioned in his statement that we have to show leadership, Britain has to show leadership in order to get the emissions down of the 99% of the rest of the world. And he also mentioned in his statement that nearly 1 billion people are at risk of drought, flooding and heat waves. Now, given the climate sceptics that now face him on the front bench opposite, can he restate for this House why it is in Britain's interests to help these people?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and the reason it is because my constituents in Doncaster have faced two supposedly 1 in 100-year events in the last 10 years or so in terms of flooding. Now, what we know is that those events will become much more extreme if we do not act. But the truth is that we can't just act on our own, we have to act with others. That is the fundamental case for multilateral engagement on these climate issues and working with others. The party opposite used to believe that, they don't seem to anymore.
Tristan Osborne.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement and also his clear global leadership over many years on this issue. A constituent, Michael Jones, a leader in climate change education, attended Baku as part of the COP delegation with a delegation of students on the climate change challenge from across the UK to lead on efforts of educating policymakers on the impacts of climate change on the next generation. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that unlike the opposition that is flip-flopping and showing no consistency on this issue, that the next generation deserves better and the government with a firm commitment to deliver with the international community on a reduction in emissions?
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right about this, which is that the truth is that, you know, they're sort of chuckling away, but the truth is a very serious and important point, Madam Deputy Speaker. The British people want us to act. They want us to act across parties on this issue. They know it is a massive threat to our country because they see it in their daily lives and they see it on the news, and they also know it is the biggest opportunity of our country. We believe it. They used to believe it. I'm afraid they are way out of step with the British people.